This is the Nuance podcast by Medicine Explained. We're your hosts, Amanda
and Dan.
We talk to experts on health, the human experience, and the intersection of climate and human health.
We explore the nuance that's been lost in today's conversation. We don't take ads because we want to keep our information unbiased.
But we do need your support. So leave a review on Apple or Spotify.
And share with your friends or on social media.
In today's conversation, we had the opportunity to speak with Dr. Yuria Celidwen, who is a native of Indigenous Nahua and Maya descent, born in Chiapas, Mexico. She received a Ph.D. and focuses on the intersection of Indigenous studies, cultural psychology, and contemplative science. From her work, she is uncovering Indigenous contemplative practices from the world and finding their place in contemplative studies. She works at the United Nations to support international humanitarian efforts for the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. Her specific concentration is the advancement of Indigenous peoples' rights and the rights of the earth. She also teaches Indigenous epistemologies and spirituality, and her work pioneered the Indigenous contemplative experience within contemplative studies. Hi, Dr. Celidwen. I'm so excited to have you on the podcast today. I've heard wonderful things about you from our friend, Dr. Nicole Redvers, and I'm really excited to talk about all of your work and then dive into the paper that y'all both wrote, featured in The Lancet, called The Determinants of Planetary Health: An Indigenous Consensus Perspective. But first, I have an introduction already recorded for you, but I really would love for you to just start and introduce yourself to me and to our audience.
Ako bamayas, binti awilalig. Ako Yuria Celidwen. Ako sa Tumbalam Nawa at Maya etik, that's Toy Halal Skinal, Chiapas, Mexico. Hakich temuk telum kinal. Yun kushinaletik Nahua Maya Celtal Skinal Chiapas. So Leni Lenape Skinal Manahata te Banti Ione. Hakits temuk stalel skulj rehal tes babich mechtatike. You just heard my Indigenous Maya Celtal language. Speaking my Indigenous language is a statement toward the reclamation and preservation of biocultural diversity. As we know, we are going through a massive extinction of species, like almost a third of species in the planet is at risk of extinction, but we are also going through cultural extinction as we lose an Indigenous language every 2 weeks. So we know there's a link between biodiversity loss and cultural extinction, so they go hand in hand. So revitalizing languages also reclaims the places of belonging of these traditions and wisdoms, but also in itself are determinants of planetary health that we will be speaking today. So it's a way of supporting the recovery and protection of the richness of our Mother Earth. And so also starting with that, I want to honor the lands, because as you know, without the land, there is no home, and so there's no life. So I want to honor the lands of my ancestors that hold the bones and ashes of my ancestors of the Nahua and Maya groups of Chiapas, and my own hometown of Ocosingo, where I was born and raised. And as you heard, also the Lenni Lenape peoples of the island of Manhattan in New York, where is my home today. And also make a note of the honoring the massive of planetary relatives that we just mentioned that have lost their homes and their lands due to the climate catastrophe and due to human impact. So just starting with that, notes a note of reflection, a note of awareness, a note of a call to consciousness of what we can do with the realities, reckoning, but then the possibilities as well, the empowering of where we want to orient our actions. And as I said, I am a native of Indigenous Maya and Nahua descent. I was born into a family of mystics, I like to say, of healers of the soul and the body in the highlands of Chiapas in Mexico for many, many generations now. And I grew with like a bridge between the wild, fertile wilderness of those cloud forests in Chiapas and also the magical realism of intellectual culture in Mexico. So I like to see myself a kind of like a mushroom spore or a dancing seed that came to these lands through the air to enhance our human connection or something like that. That's kind of like my more metaphorical, maybe my more spiral Indigenous identity speaking. But with my other hat as well, I am a scholar of contemplative Indigenous traditions of the world. In my research is on the intersection of Indigenous studies, contemplative studies, and cultural psychology. And I've been very interested, probably genetics, like coming from the family, but very interested in this interdisciplinary approaches to the experience of self-transcendence. Like self-transcendence, like the idea of focusing on the needs and well-being of others, and how this is embodied in or enhances pro-social behaviors. That would be like ethics and compassion, kindness, a sense of reverence, especially, and a sense of awe and sacredness and love for the larger community of beings, so for Mother Earth. And I am uncovering these contemplative practices of the world, bringing them into the contemplative studies field, which had up to these few last years no Indigenous representation. And so I've been having this quest of reclaiming that space. And I also work tirelessly for the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals, and with a concentration of the defense of the rights of the earth and the rights of Indigenous peoples.
Thank you so much for that introduction. So you mentioned a couple of things that I'm going to touch on in our conversation. One is about ecological belonging.
Yeah.
So what exactly does that mean? For me, there seems to be a couple of camps when you're listening to people talk about humans and the environment. And that includes either humans shouldn't exist because the planet would be better without them, or that humans deserve to dominate over the earth because we're like, quote unquote, a special species, like a 1 in a million type of species. So where and how can humans belong in our ecology, and what does ecological belonging mean?
Fascinating questions. Thank you. Thank you, Amanda. And well, yes, so much of the work that I've been doing is precisely grounded in this idea of ecological belonging, of self and spirit, which conveys a profound sense of or awareness, realization of self and others, committed to strong interrelationships. So ecological belonging is within a much larger thesis that I developed a few years back and that I continue to work on. With this realization of being part of a collective earth system, so a larger system, awareness of being part of ecosystems and life cycles. This is also based on indigenous ontologies or cosmologies, and it manifests as an identity or a group-based identity that's based on the earth. It has different components, but it manifests through affective, like this compassionate, caring for the needs of others, but also cognitive, like there's an acknowledgement, there's the assessment, realization, and the responsibility of the volition to change these actions, and the motivation to care and steward the earth and the communities. So it's an engagement towards life forms and the natural world that convene in very clear aims for flourishing. and flourishing. So many times we hear it lately, the human flourishing, right? But from the indigenous perspective, we push it. It's not about the human. We are part of a natural world that includes any species, human and other than human species. And they all interdepend for an environmental wellness or well-being. So there is, of course, no human flourishing without Mother Earth flourishing. So from my work on indigenous contemplative science, I've developed this as I said, of the ethics of belonging, which is where ecological belonging is nested. And this is a commitment or a responsibility of individual within a community, and that is responsible with conscious and care for the larger environment. So it's always grounded within the community first, before the individual, right? So it's an important natural tendency, let's say, for cooperation that has been argued lately that it is what the natural being for humans are. It's not the conditioning for greed or self-benefit has been learned from cultural narratives. So the two perspectives that you mentioned speak about this. Mother Earth being better without humans, that's one, right? And then the other one that humans deserve to be the dominant species. But I may note that perhaps these two camps are coming from Western perspectives, probably, and I say this because they are very human-centered, Probably, as I've been saying, this collective or cultural narratives, ideologies of domination come from possibly Abrahamic traditions, religious narratives that speak about a dominant being, usually a male, that then is or has been given the authority to rule over others. Also, there has been suggested lately that this may be a wrongly translated of the original text, that emphasized dominion over stewardship, but that it may be a nuance in the original Hebrew. So that would have to be said. But in the end, these are ideas that emphasize the place of authority for one specific rulership, right? But then the other one that you said, the Mother Earth being better without humans, then again is depriving human beings of their natural belonging as well. Human beings are also part of nature, not a part of, as constantly has been perceived, right, in the West. So once we start recovering our natural earthling quality and identity, then rather than othering ourselves from nature, as a non-belonging species, rather we would then start behaving as part of this larger system, responsible of this larger system, and having the possibility to exist in an interdependent, caring, compassionate way to other species and phenomena that also belong within these systems, right? So we have to recover that we are natural beings, that we are earthlings, and we are looking for that conduciveness of ecological belonging. So it's looking for a possibility of setting practical actions toward a universal goal of flourishing of all species, and being, looking for indigenous scientific systems that observe this possibilities, within our stories, retelling the conditioned story of domination from stories of belonging. And so this is something that we need to relearn. So compost those old stories that are not serving our communities and the earth any longer, and retell our stories, our identities, from identities that set us part of a system, create a sense of reverence, like this place of awe, of being in the presence of something larger than ourselves, which is the beauty of nature, and then the responsibility, understanding the suffering of the beings that we have impacted, the responsibility of then restoring and protecting and conserving all these other beings.
That was a beautiful answer. Thank you. Thank you. And so if I myself or my listeners have grown up in this Western society and we have a little bit more of the human-centric ideology, just because that's what has been taught to us in our culture, it seems that it lends a little bit to what you were talking about in your introduction when you talked about self-transcendence. So looking beyond the individual, looking beyond ourself. And in order to see the larger picture, the ecological belonging, seeing ourselves intertwined with not only other people and having compassion for other people, but for non-human species as well. So I know that you both practice and teach some pro-social practices. And so for these pro-social practices, why are they so important for our overall health and planetary health? And what are some practices that our listeners could try out?
Yes, I love that you centered the question on practice, right? Because it's exactly that. It's a practice that just gets better and better as we carry it out, every day. It's not something that's stagnant. It's rather organic. It's moving, changing, and transforming constantly, but it's impacted by our intention, right? So contemplative studies, which is a broader field, including sciences and pedagogies, stories, narratives, etc., philosophies, aim to create that sense of reflection. The field is specifically focusing on introducing a first-person critical observation. So, like, what is my experience? What is my experience towards events that are happening or phenomena? I want to also push the indigenous perspective that also speaks about a second person experience. So then again, not only the individual, but the dialogue, the constant interconnection between self and others, as we are part of it. We are not alone in any space. We're not atomic beings, right? We are always responding and also impacting on other beings. So my push in the field is starting to have those kinds of observation reflections of how we are creating that dialogue, and how we are impacting others. So in the 21st century, there has been a lot of Western scientific study on practices and emotion studies that distinguish these positive aspects of emotions and how to enhance them. And so there has been this category of pro-social emotions called self-transcendent, that are coordinating or orienting aspects of life, that cultivate resilience, adaptation, and collaboration that are benefiting life. But then again, bringing the indigenous perspective, it's not only about benefiting human life, but benefiting all of our relation, all of our relatives in the natural world. So these self-transcendent emotions, looking for the safety, for the security of resources, encouraging the assessment of the virtues of others, of the needs of others, but then also the suffering of others, that the transcendence, like not only of self. So these pro-social emotions like awe, like reverence, like compassion, kindness, as I was saying earlier, they reduce the focus on one's own needs and behaviors to start building stronger social networks, start building, focusing on the needs of others, alleviating the suffering of others, looking for the flourishing of others. And then, of course, numerous findings have shown how these practices have improved the well-being, certainly of humans, decreasing stress levels, improving cardiovascular health, better self-esteem, etc. But then I would say, and indigenous traditions would say, indigenous knowledge would say that this moves beyond the self to include very holistic systems of respecting individuals within larger societal and ecological systems. And then we root our actions with a clear contemplative or conscious intention of what is that, what will be our impact, but then also rooted in a sense of gratitude, in a sense of reverence for life itself, with a kind of like firm responsibility of this sense of stewardship that I keep talking, the sense of belonging, ecological belonging, enhances or helps rise the responsibility, that we are bound to this reverence and utmost respect for Mother Nature and all relatives in our environmental relationships, and caring for those relationships with that kind of tenderness and compassion.
Thank you so much. That was a really great answer. And so I would love to jump into a little bit about the paper that was featured in The Lancet that you and your colleagues, including Dr. Nicole Redvers, co-authored. So again, this is called The Determinants of Planetary Health, an Indigenous Consensus Perspective. And for our listeners, first of all, I know that before we started recording, you were explaining a little bit about why this paper is so important and so special. So can you please repeat that for our listeners? And then also just what are some of the main takeaways for our listeners?
Yes, such a heartfelt paper, definitely. And of course, this was a greater team effort, right? This is a family effort, right? It's, of course, led by Dr. Redvers and relatives from all over the world, different indigenous voices coming together to reclaim not only the voices of indigenous peoples in the aspect of the contribution of how indigenous wisdom can help restore the elements of the environmental urgency right now, but also because there hadn't been before any conversation about the determinants of planetary health, right? There is a lot of talk about the determinants of human health, which all of those are important. Of course, they are very important for the well-being of our societies. But then again, we are missing that very core aspect, that we are embedded within larger societies that are not only human, right? So there hadn't been before this paper a conversation about planetary health, and fortunately right now it's expanding and there's an awareness and there's much more interest on this. But I think this paper was really a breakthrough in this field. So the beauty about this paper as well is that it's a family effort. It's relatives from all over the world coming together. And also that we use a methodology based on indigenous ways of knowing, right? So that is another aspect that we are bringing together bridges of knowing, right? So it's not only one way that has the authority of understanding the world. But now we are starting to have these different conversations, these really, truly diverse ways of knowing. The problems that we are facing today at a planetary level, of course, are contextual. So we need the very different voices that are being impacted by these conditions to contribute on ways to assess and then respond, adapt to these challenges. So this paper is exactly that. And so within the long conversations that we had, the consensus process that we had, an indigenous consensus process, we found 10 main determinants of planetary health. And they are under three overarching determinants, which are Mother Earth determinants, because then again, we have to start with the larger system. We have to start with Mother Earth. And then the interconnected determinants, right? Like the interdependent determinants. And then finally, the indigenous peoples determinants of planetary health. Many of these, the whole consensus process were already coming from indigenous cosmovisions from different places, different parts of the world. This was a global effort. And they, of course, speak of the indigenous cosmovisions or worldviews, of the long-term sustainability and health of Mother Earth, of the planet. So this is closely related to what we were talking earlier about ecological belonging. So see, it's the embodying of universal interconnectedness as a transformational, relational process of understanding our place within the larger system, within the world. And then this place can stimulate an integration, and a sense of responsibility to the larger world. This awakened, I would say, or this conscious sense of interdependence between people and planet can be achieved then through the gradual process of awareness, but more importantly, action that depends on the human potential for relationality. So going back to the earlier comment of, is nature better without humans? Well, because humans are part of nature and we deserve our place in nature, we can also help restore nature and conserve and protect ecological and environmental systems faster. Just as the human impact has been the most important to the climate catastrophe, we also can readjust or restore and repair these systems with the possibilities that we have at hand. So as we start adapting these all-inclusive considerations for our Mother Earth, our relatives in the other than human societies, we start also creating senses of belonging, places of belonging, inclusive societies, institutions that are embracing these diverse knowledges. I spoke earlier, orienting our strong actions and possibilities for the well-being of the earth and all other living beings that inhabit Mother Earth. So these determinants are ways to orient what's going on, what's the problematics that we are facing, and then what can be done, the actions that we need to start changing not only personal lifestyle, but public policy, production patterns, and economic and political commitments. It's a call to action. It's a call to action for the world, for planetary, waking up, that human health is only dependent on planetary health. So this indigenous perspective that brings us back into our place within a larger society of living beings and our responsibilities to them, like reiterating just this ecological belonging idea.
Yeah, wow, that was a really good outline. And I just want to say that I've read a lot of papers, and this was one of my favorite papers that I've read, and mostly because it changed some of my perspectives, and it was a call to action, and it made me feel inspired, and it was also scientific. So it was a perfect blend of all.
Yes, I am curious actually, because you mentioned, you read a lot of papers. Of course, you're in med school, so that this call to action really moved you in many ways. So I'll switch places for a moment and ask you, like, what were those steerings, the movements that happened?
So for me, every time that I listen to Indigenous wisdom from an Indigenous person or reading your paper, everything just seems to make sense. We think about things in such isolation. And I think the most inspiring part of like the 10 determinants of health is that it's a lot of interconnection. Everything is a system. And that's something that I found in medical care as well, is that when we look at things in isolation, like a heart doctor or a gut doctor or a brain doctor, it doesn't necessarily make sense because everything talks to one another. And that is on a larger scale as well. And when more Western studies talk about those things, it's very much in isolation. And also like the policies that we create are very one size fits all, which is leading to my next question, because I do think that the world is so different. Humans are so different. Ecology is so different everywhere. So we can't have the same solution for everything. So the way that you and your colleagues speak to the climate and to healing the planet, they're frameworks that we can use everywhere, but it isn't we need to like do this specific type of farming for regenerative farming in this, like for all of locations. Like it's all very land-based. So that leads me to my next question, which is we a lot of times talk about solutions for the climate as a one-size-fits-all. Doesn't even, like even within the United States, like the whole United States is so different and so unique. There's so much biodiversity, both in human culture and in ecological culture, biodiversity. And so why can the solutions not be one size fit all and has to be more land-based in solving the climate problem?
Yes, and thank you so much for responding to my curiosity. See, it is a dialogue.
Yes, I love it. Thank you for asking.
Yes. But because it's exactly that. No, it's a systems reality that we live. No, it's always things that are responding to another. We can't find just one, as you say, the one quick fix or one pill to solve it all, or a template for every situation, right? The problem with the West has been so much this impatience, perhaps, the inability to be able to sit still, observe, and then reflect. There's this strong drive for action, which is great in many aspects. Look, so what so much has been done because of that drive. But then again, there are moments in which their needs of stillness and their needs for dynamics. There's this constant dance of balance within the larger cycles of nature. So then, of course, we are a part of those cycles as well. And within your question, why can't there be just like one size fits all? Because simply nature is not like that, right? But so why is it that it can't, one side doesn't fit all, and the need for the quick fix doesn't work with the greatest climate challenges and the impacts that we are facing today. Within traditional cultures, there is a misunderstanding and maybe a tendency to universalize this wisdom, right? But indigenous peoples are so vastly diverse. There are around 5,000 indigenous groups in the world, living in 90 countries all around the world. So they are exposed to different conditions. All of this wisdom and knowledge, assortment of information, should not be just treated as information, right? So like what Western scientific knowledge is, right? These are traditions that come for generations and generations that are responding from systems of observation, of community-based, land-based ways of knowing, holistic ways, that take in account the dependency that we were speaking earlier, the interdependency between all beings, that are very interconnected to the landscapes, the challenges, the conditions that people are living within their own environments. As I said, imagine 5,000 different groups all over the world. They will have extremely different conditions in the Arctic that they would have in the Amazon or that they would have in the desert, right? So we have to understand that these traditional knowledges are very contextual. They are based also sources of knowledge of environmental strategic management in very distinct, specific ecosystems, right? The problematics of adaptation may be similar, but we can't ever assume that because we understand one situation, then that would can be translated to all other situations, right? The moment that we try to just bring foreign conditions into our own, they may actually be losing their own meaning and their own purpose. Within indigenous traditions, this wisdom has been developing by, as I said, systems of observation and testing, as well hypothesizing as in similar with Western systems. But our ways of indigenous science is based on these narratives of relationships, right? The understanding between the knowledge making and then the knowledge application. But this happens regionally, right? This happens contextually. So the whole understanding or epistemology based on the land are embedded within the ways indigenous traditions or groups, nations, steward their own landscapes, right? Protect their own sacred landscapes and systems. So it's also a way of responding to the rights of governance of indigenous peoples, the indigenous natural law or first law that also respects and recognizes the personhood of Mother Earth, right? And so in that sense that land-specific or nation-specific laws are rooted in very complex, very interconnected notions of responsibility, as stewardship, as going back to the ecological belonging aspect, the relationality and reciprocity within a larger system of beings. That is not only the human values, but the value of the whole living Earth system. So these indigenous cosmovisions or worldviews are as connected to their land and nation and traditions that cannot be really inherently the same with others. And that also is the beauty of it. We could learn from different aspects and then adapt it to our own, right? Understand from these constantly changing, constantly transforming situations, how to adapt them in the way that speak to the needs and conditions that we are facing in our specific contexts.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's very, very well explained. Thank you. And something that really stands out to me is that we have to be in conversation with these Indigenous people across the world because they already have that land-based knowledge. But the problem a lot of the times is there's been a lot of extraction from Indigenous folks. So how do we learn from Indigenous wisdom and use their knowledge without co-opting it or being extractive?
Thank you for bringing this up, because this is a very, very important and very sensitive topic as well, you know, for Indigenous tangible and intangible property, you know, like cultural, intellectual property. You know? So we need to understand this serious concerns of appropriation, extraction, capitalization, corporatization, commodification of Indigenous wisdom that happens over and over, and that continues to happen. And right now, just this as a note, we're also working on this project to defend the Indigenous medicine systems towards the capitalization of the psychedelic movement that is really problematic at this moment. But this is another project that I'll be happy to talk about in another moment. But this is something that we are constantly facing. That's what I mean. You know? So understanding the difference between appropriation and then effective allyship, right? So seeing these two different ways. Appropriation, yes, is taking without permission, you know, of others, and then not only taking but then transforming it, you know, to your own benefits. And most times, as it happens constantly in the West, they have an economic benefit, right? So being very mindful of these issues implies tremendous courageous. It's a courageous journey of reflection. You know? Then again, bringing back the contemplative practices, you know, reflecting, observing, and understanding what the impact is, and a lot of conversation, right? Conversation that has to be participatory. It's a dialogue with the peoples that are being affected, right? So it's not only Westerns minding that they have the whole understanding, but rather conversing. What would be the most respectful way to engage with these different traditions? You know? How would be the best way to maybe learn from tradition or replicating in a way that is respectful and that is inclusive? You know? So not only taking the mic and then replicating privileged voices, you know, or weird voices, you know, Western educated, industrialized, rich and of democratic origin, as it's called, the weird groups, but rather starting to create platforms of participation. You know? Colonization, as we know, and coloniality manifests in so many different forms. You know, we live in structures that are perpetuating these systems time and again without apparent notice. So this is a long process, you know, of reckoning, understanding these old stories, this conditioning, owning what has been that part, and then decolonizing our own minds, bodies, actions, institutions, systems, etc. So standing with, but not in place, right? Not to take on the leadership of the work of Indigenous voices, but being Indigenous voices, the ones to lead these conversations, right? So creating these places for credibility and validation with support of other systems of knowledge, right? Authority should be carried in a community, not in one single system of understanding the world, right? So, and let me, when I say validation, it's like we don't need validation, right? Validation is already recognized and determined by our own systems. But making or creating spaces, in that privilege can be held in a community based, right? Of course, there has to be reparations. There has to be equal standing of conversation for that, because there has been constant marginalization of voices. There is very hard to create places of real equal standing when there has been abuse, constant abuse. So for that, there needs to be a reparation process, a reckoning process to restore the authorities, to restore places, to return lands, return authority, return systems with places, so that there can be places of conversation in respectful ways. And then, of course, creating those spaces mean equal standing in all aspects, economic aspects, governance aspects, political influence, etc. It's a very complicated, intersectional. As we have been saying, it's a systemic concern.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that with me, because that'll help me move forward in the future, and then with my listeners as well. That's part of the reason why I invite folks like you, like Dr. Celidwen, to be on this podcast, because I can read your paper and I can regurgitate what I learned from your paper onto my podcast and to our listeners. But instead, I want to amplify Indigenous voices, because you're the ones who are doing the work. You're the ones with the knowledge. So I really appreciate what you were saying. And thank you so much for sharing that with us. We do only have a few minutes left. And I do just want to stress what we've been talking about here. So a lot of it is interconnection and ecological belonging. And something that we want to do on this podcast, because I'm coming from the healthcare side of things, is interconnect human health and planetary health. And just in everything you've been talking about, how we belong to one another, to our ecology, that if something is sick in this planet, if we're destroying our waterways, we can't survive with polluted water, with polluted air. If we're losing biodiversity in plants and animals, it affects humans as well, because we're all interconnected. So a planetary health is a human health issue. Like you were saying, it's not human-centric. Is there anything else that you want to leave our listeners with before I ask you our final question?
Well, to reinstate as well, dear Amanda, that it is a dialogue, right? It's a conversation that we would be needing to have. It's places of belonging are not about including within an established system, but rather co-creating a participatory system in which each voice has equal standing, equal place, and contribute to solutions that will impact and benefit all. I would like to maybe just leave you with a very tiny poem of Indigenous Nahua wisdom that speaks about this. And in the original Nahua language, it says like this: Kazan achitzinka, kazan kualachik, zani palzinko, titishima kiko intotekuyo. Kanel umpatosen chan, umpatosen popoliuyan, umpatlatlapatlaoa, kaoichen onkis. We are only merely here a tiny bit. Merely in this place, we come to know ourselves in our divinity. Truth is, our shared home is there, where we are to be composted, where the earth is widened, where we become one. Hokolawal Tlasukamati, gracias. And thank you so much for having me and for creating these places of conversation.
Thank you for all the work that you're doing. I hope that we stay in conversation and stay in touch. I'm really inspired by both you and the paper and the wisdom that you have to share. So thank you so much for everything and for joining us on our podcast today.
Yes, may these be seeds that we are sowing in the hearts of the world. But it's our garden. It's our collective garden. So we have to tend it together.
Absolutely. Have a great day. Thank you so much.
You too. Much love.